Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Rich Lee. I'm the executive director of the Jandoli Institute. And I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight, or if you're watching this, the recording for our continuing media studies across disciplines project. And just a few words about what that kind of longish title means. It's a project that we're doing with the Jandoli Institute, where we have a series of papers that we're posting this summer that were written by people who work in different departments, and we asked them to write something that connects their discipline with journalism, with communication. And this is the fourth one. We have 8 of them, so we're right at the halfway point. It's been a great experience, the ones we've done so far. I think for the journalists or the journalism professors, it's given us an opportunity to see how people view our profession. And for the other folks, it's helped them understand a little bit about how journalism, how communication works. Wanted to welcome folks who are on. You can see our presenter, Phil Payne. We have a great panel, Lou Jacobson from PolitiFact, Brad Lawrence from Message and Media, and Joe Marin from Buffalo State. I'll be talking about them a bit more. The way the format is going to be, Phil is going to have 10, 15 minutes to talk about his paper. After that, he'll engage in a Q&A with the panel, and we'll eventually open it up to the audience. So I would say, if you're not on the panel and you have a question, best thing to do is to send a message via the chat feature, and I'll either read your question or just unmute your mic so you can ask it yourself. So just a few housekeeping things before we start. I always like to thank the people who made this possible. So that's the Leo J. Keenan Faculty Endowment Fund and the Jandoli School of Communication helped fund this project, all the papers that were written. So I want to thank all the authors. Particularly want to thank Phil because it is a summer project, but he actually wrote 2 papers which we were able to post in the fall. We had a conversation, and he said, there's a lot of similarities between the 1920 election with Harding and what's going to happen in 2020. He did those 2 papers, and of course we didn't know about the pandemic then, so now we have a third or another similarity, which we're going to talk about tonight. So I want to thank the authors, I want to thank the panelists. Also want to thank the people who were with us tonight to listen and hopefully engage in the dialogue. So with that, I will turn it over to Phil Payne, Chair of the History Department at St. Bonaventure University. And Phil, if you have any graphics or images, I set it up so you should be able to share the screen.
Okay. We'll see. I don't right now, but if something comes up, I mean, there's such a media-rich environment in 1920. We can always pull something up. So basically, yeah, and thanks, Rich, for letting me do this. So one of the things I was doing with this paper, what I was thinking about is, I'm reading all the news, following the 1920 election pretty carefully, and Harding is popping up. And I don't know, about a decade ago, I wrote a book on Harding, and it wasn't a biography of Harding per se. It was a study of Harding's reputation as our worst president. And then so basically at that point, I took it up through Bill Clinton, and because this was not long after Bill Clinton's impeachment, and there was obviously a lot of comparisons between Harding and Nan Britton, and who was a young woman he had an affair with, and Monica Lewinsky and Bill Clinton. So, and I should also say that before I came to Bonaventure, I spent a brief period of time at the Warren G. Harding home in Marion, Ohio, which is getting renovated now, and I'm really excited to go see that. Maybe if the pandemic ends, we can start vacationing again. And so while I was at the Harding home, I became interested in the idea of how do you talk to the public about Harding, who was president 2.5 years, give or take, and died in office, was very popular, but then his reputation just descends with various scandals. And that's kind of not the point of tonight, but that's kind of what got me on this topic of the difference between academic history, social history, the political uses of history, the way one structures narrative around this. So I'm watching the 1920 election, and they're starting to refer to Joe Biden as running a front porch campaign, which Harding ran the last of the front porch campaigns from Marion, Ohio. And so for those of you who don't know, front porch campaign is basically the candidate. And I think it's not completely, but a little bit misunderstood when people talk about today. So the front porch campaign was a transition thing that happened for several presidential elections where the candidate would stay home. So Harding's a good, well-known example of this. William McKinley did this. Garfield did it. They would stay home, and essentially they would bring the voters to them, and then they would turn it into a media event. So particularly in Harding's case, but also in the others, it was a throwback to nostalgia. It was Harding's hometown of Marion, Ohio was put on display as the good old days. It's very nostalgia laden. But then the thing about it is they used the most modern of techniques to sell this. So Harding was the first campaign to have a to hire a press person to run their public relations. So I was thinking about that, and I was like, well, Biden's not really doing a front porch campaign per se. Biden's forced to do this because we're in a pandemic, right? Like this isn't, Harding Republican Party made a conscious choice. They were going to promote this image of Harding. They were going to bring in celebrities. They were going to hire camera crews. They were going to stage events to project this image of Harding. Like that was a conscious choice, whereas Biden was, because we're in the middle of a pandemic, forced to do certain things. And that was what got me thinking about it. And the next logical step for me was like, well, I've read a lot about the 1920 election, both secondary sources and primary sources, and they really didn't talk about the Spanish flu, as they called it. They talked about a lot of other things, and as I point out in my paper, it's not that, and I want to be careful here, because it's not that Harding was ignoring the big issues of the day. What Harding had a real skill at doing was talking around the issues. He would refer to it as bloviating. And what he'd do is he'd just come out and just say a lot of platitudes and say things, but he did address things. Like like I talked about in my paper, he talked about race relations. He talked about the end of World War I. He talked about, but a lot of what he did kind of one step below the sort of big national things was that when they were having this front porch campaign, they'd invite people in, and they would have a day around various constituencies, like Women's Day, because women's suffrage had just come into place. Or there'd be another town would come in, or it'd be a certain body of workers. But Harding would come out and he'd weave this sort of national narrative, and he'd weave their local history, which was all often very generic, but he'd weave it into this national narrative and sort of create this sense that, well, we're all in this kind of story together, the story of America. And I thought, that's really different than what we're doing now. And that kind of left me with a couple things. Like, one, in 1920, like a lot of really bad things were happening. Race relations were terrible. We were the Spanish flu, this pandemic. World War I had left a sour taste in people's mouths. We were in the first Red Scare. There's a lot to talk about. And essentially at this point, it struck me as Americans are forgetting the 1918 pandemic. In 1920, they're sort of forgetting it. And I always tell my students, it's worth looking at when you're looking at how society deals with history. So not academics, but the history as it functions in our society, how we remember, how we commemorate, how we use it to create community. What we choose to forget is just as important as what we choose to remember. And that was what I was saying about it. And I think in a lot of ways with Harding, and I'm not the first person to say this, is that in 1918 pandemics, they were serious. A lot of the same things were going on that goes on today in terms of social distancing and masks, and people not liking them, and the economy. But they also lived in a world where this sort of thing just happened. Like they didn't have the medical treatments we have. They didn't expect the federal government to respond at the same level. And so I was thinking, like, when people were making these comparisons between Biden and Trump, who are running for the presidency, and in some ways when I wrote this, although I think Biden is pivoting away from this maybe a little bit now, they were both sort of running on this nostalgia ticket. One, Biden, let's go back to the good old days of Obama, and I think Trump's Make America Great Again is a clear reference to nostalgia. But I think one of the things that we had going on here is that that we're in the middle of an emergency. Times have changed. People expect the federal government to respond to things like pandemics. And then I also think the context has changed. Like Biden was not running a front porch campaign of choice. He was running he was doing what I'm doing, sitting in his basement talking to a computer over Zoom because that's what he had to do. It was not a designed event. Like, they did not plan this. They simply were adapting to the moment, the context of media and pandemic. And I thought that was sort of lost in some of the coverage, and that's where I went with my paper. So, is that, you want me to ramble on some more, or is that good?
Yeah, I think we're good. I think let's start the discussion, and let me kick it off by, I know you mentioned how, Biden's not running a front porch campaign by choice, but going back to Harding, what made his front porch campaign successful?
Well, with Harding, one, Harding, like Woodrow Wilson, was really unpopular, and he's not going to run again. But the Democratic Party can't escape his shadow, like at the end of World War I in 1920. And Wilson, even though he's not running, is still sort of forcing the Democratic Party to run on the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations. And so basically the Democratic Party sort of shackled with that. And what made Harding successful was, and I think this is really important, is Harding comes from a newspaper background. He understands the media. He understands the press. He got along with them really well. Like, there's all sorts of pictures because he bought a Sears, one of those old Sears buildings you could order from the catalog, and put it behind his house where he campaigned from. And he would just go out back and hang out with the journalists. Like, there's just all these pictures of him kind of like basically putting a boot on the stairs and, hanging out and chewing the fat. But they were very careful about how they crafted the image of Harding, because Harding had certain talents and certain weaknesses. One of his talents is he could stand up on a porch and talk to all of his neighbors and give a good, very entertaining speech. He could bloviate. He could give a stem winder. He could make people feel welcome. And then they could capture that on film or on record it, and then they could put that film footage in newsreels. So even though they were talking about like this very old-fashioned image of Harding with his boater and he's a very familiar figure, they're using basically state-of-the-art in terms of media to get that message out. So I think in a lot modern sense, it's sort of like if you tried to sell nostalgia over Facebook, it'd be a similar thing.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's 1920, but a lot of what they're doing kind of reminds me of 2020. But let's turn to the panel. And, Lou, I'd like to start with you because I know you've been following the race for PolitiFact, the other outlets that you write for. I mean, do you kind of agree with Phil that Biden is running a front porch campaign? And what do you see as a strategy?
Yeah, I mean, as Phil said, this is not a strategy of choice. It was thrust upon him very quickly. There was no planning for it. It's been pretty successful, I think. Basically, Trump says a lot of things that tend to be controversial, and so often the best way for Trump's opponents to proceed with their campaign is just to let Trump get into his own trouble and stay out of the picture. So actually, I mean, while no one would have suggested this as a campaign strategy, I don't think before the pandemic, it seems to be working pretty well. I mean, he's sort of made forays out to make major speeches and stuff, but in general, he's not kind of on the news every day, and that's probably not a bad thing for his chances of winning at this point.
You think it's sustainable? You think he's going to have to change his strategy between now and November 3rd?
I mean, I think we'll probably see some strategy changes. When the convention comes, it'll obviously be a different feel to it in that period. We'll see how the course of the pandemic develops and whether he'll actually be able to get out and do some speeches in public. The way things are looking now, it wouldn't surprise me if this stays more or less the same kind of dynamic. I think for the voters that he considers his base, and even those who are persuadable voters, tend to be pretty cautious about the coronavirus. And I think that staying in his home, venturing out pretty carefully, with a mask and everything, is probably the best approach for getting their support and their keeping them on his side. I think that if he took a more Trump-like approach, more risk-tolerant approach of having special events, unmasked events, inside or outside, it would go counter to his brand. His brand right now is caution, personal caution, and competence. And I think that this actually goes pretty well with the type of campaign he's been forced to run.
Yeah, I kind of remember back before the pandemic in the primaries when he, had his big turnaround. He did well in the states that he didn't even go to, if I recall correctly.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
But I just want to turn to Brad for strategy, because I'd like to get your thoughts, Brad, on where you see Biden going, but also maybe without giving away any secrets. I know you work with candidates. How are they coping with running campaigns when you can't do retail politics?
Well, you can do retail politics in sort of a different way these days. Obviously, not the old-fashioned door knocking, but I think what's interesting in building on what the other two gentlemen said, Biden is actually running what traditionally would have been called the presidential campaign. In other words, he looks more like a president, whatever that means. He sounds more like a president, and Trump is sort of the aggressor because that's who Trump is. And I think Biden has not only taken advantage of the ability to have this more presidential demeanor, both naturally and because of the situation with the coronavirus, but he has, I think, been able to feed on the image of people talking about it being calm and competent. I mean, his speech on coronavirus a week or two ago, that's the kind of speech a president would normally give. And I think you have this odd reversal of roles here where Trump is behaving as the challenger in a sense of being aggressive and throwing all kinds of things around. And Biden, both in part because he's forced to, but equally because I think he sees that as the way to drive the difference, is in fact behaving, say, maybe it's an outmoded term considering Trump is redefining whatever it means to be presidential, I suppose. But in fact, Biden is the more traditional presidential of the two. In terms of other candidates and campaigns and how they, you're seeing, because of technology, you can in fact reach out to people. I mean, even as we're doing here, Zoom is, for example, very popular among those that are raising money. There are all these online fundraisers. They're very successful, as you can see. The amount of money being raised, both just generally through, internet solicitation and specifically in the big dollar fundraisers that are happening on Zoom, there's no diminution of the fundraising. In terms of voter contact, at the end of the day, particularly at a presidential level, the amount of actual voter contact that a candidate can do compared to the mass of the electorate is minimal. So while events get covered and all of that, they really are generally an infinitesimal way of how you reach voters. Their field campaigns are obviously much more important in that respect, but even those are adapting. So it's different, but it's still, I think, in many ways similar.
Okay, thanks. Joe, I'll have you kind of wrap up this section, maybe from a media perspective. How does the press cover a race like this, or what should they be doing that may be different from a normal race?
Well, I think, I remember reading Tim Krause's book, The Boys on the Bus, way back in 70, whenever, talking about how the press was covering that race then. And it was the kind of like follow the candidate around, wear yourself down into the ground, following the candidate around. And it's just not like that anymore. It doesn't have to be that way anymore because of social media, because of tweets. One thing Phil pointed out that I really liked in his article was, Harding really kind of knew how to manipulate the media such as it was then. He knew how to go out and talk to the reporters in the back of the House. There would be women's suffrage days. There would be Buffalo, New York days. Maybe there might have been a Goya products day for all I know. Kind of like the other day. What Cox had to do is because as Phil pointed out, Cox is running on, unfortunately for him, on Wilson's coattails, and Wilson is unpopular at this time. Wilson is talking about the League of Nations, and the country doesn't want to hear about the League of Nations. The country wants to hear about getting the economy back. Wow. Where did that come from? The country is tired of dealing with the wartime leftovers. So Cox is actually going out and campaigning, and his running mate is FDR. FDR is somewhat involved, and Phil knows more about this better than I do, but they lose. They know they're going to lose. The Republicans are going to say, well, we don't have to do all that. We can sit here and manage the campaign from Harding's front door or back door, wherever. And that's what they did. And there's a story, and Phil, tell me if this is true or not, but every now and then when Harding would go out on the stump, he'd read these canned speeches. And at one point, I don't know where it was, but he's reading it and he stumbles over and he goes, wait a minute, what's this all about? I've never read this before. I didn't write this. So he didn't have to worry about going out and doing that. And that was, as Phil pointed out, the modern way of covering, modern meaning 20th century way of covering campaigns evolved. Really one of the, not the first time, but one of the first times that a candidate actually campaigned was Stephen Douglas in 1860. And he was criticized in the press. One example is he says he's going to go visit his mother, who at that time was living in Clifton Springs, New York, just south of Rochester. But he goes to visit his mother via Philadelphia and Hartford and New York and Boston. And so the press is saying, what's this all about? And there's one newspaper, it was a newspaper in Iowa, I forget which one it was, but they had this poem about it saying, here he's going around, he has to speak, but really he's only looking for his mother, and so on and so forth. So when we get to the 20th century, we have a whole new way of campaigning, and that's what we in the 21st century are used to. So how do we cover a campaign? Well, we're still used to doing it the old way. And yet we're used to doing it the old way, and look where we are right now. Phil's in his basement, I'm in my den. We're worried about the tornado coming through and ripping our connection apart, but we can do this. So we have to adapt, and how we're going to adapt, we're still trying to figure that out. That was a long answer to a very short question, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. I was going to say, first, I wanted to remind the people who are on the call, if you have a question, send it to us through the chat feature. We have one already, but I kind of pulled an audible on the panel. I told everyone you'd have a chance to ask a question, and I asked all of you a question. So let me kind of circle back and, go to you, Lou. Do you have a question or a comment or something on Phil's paper?
Yeah, kind of a question / comment. And by the way, I should say that I actually went once to Teapot Dome to write a story. So.
Ooh, I have never been to Teapot Dome.
So one thing that was striking is it seems that from your research that there was not a lot of discussion about the pandemic during the campaign, and part of this might be because it didn't get a lot of news coverage. It sounds like there was pressure, either external or internal, not to cover it in the previous couple of years. So question one is, how much do we actually know, because there isn't that newspaper coverage, about how people kind of perceived the pandemic, and obviously a lot of people must have had family members who died from it or whatever. It seems hard to believe that it wouldn't have been a major concern for them. So I'll just stop there.
So, okay, so from my understanding of the pandemic, and I'm much stronger on the Harding politics side of this than the pandemic side of it. So part of it was what I said before is just sort of dawning on me. It's just not part of the political rhetoric at the time.
Yeah.
And you're right, the Wilson administration doesn't really want to talk about it. They still have bond rallies, even though often local officials are saying don't have rallies, and people are wearing masks. You've probably seen these floating around the internet of people at baseball games and whatnot with face coverings. I just realized that really doesn't work in Zoom to do that. So it's not that it's not there. It's very hard to tell what kind of average people thought. There's one of the books I read, and I'm drawing a blank on it now. But it's a recent book, and she spent a lot of time looking at things like diaries and novels and poems to kind of get a sense of that. because so I think it's that it's there and it's somewhat politicized, but it's not politicized like the way it is now. And I think in part because, and you know, I could be wrong here, but I think we have an expectation that the president's supposed to deal with this.
Right.
And in 1920, that's a significantly less of an expectation.
Right.
Yeah.
It sounds like it was more of a disaster event than
Yes.
a pandemic.
It's more like how we would think of a hurricane or a flood. And there's some expectation. Yeah, there's, you know, you don't completely ignore it, but there's not expectation that the government will just swoop in and there'll be a big federal agency
Right.
to take care of it.
Yeah, and you made the point in the paper and in your remarks, Phil, just there was kind of a way of life back then, like pandemics, the war, other catastrophes.
Yeah, and then one of the things that really struck me when I was reading the books on the pandemic is just the difficulty in figuring out how many people died of this, because it's also wrapped up in other diseases, secondary infections, and then it's taking place, at least in the early stage of it, during World War One. So what's the cause of death? Is it the flu? Is it the fact that the flu is spreading through the trenches and you're in a war and it's already naturally very dangerous? And that really struck me as just it's difficult. And I think the 1918 pandemic often kind of disappeared until a few years ago, and you started to see books reemerging about it. Like when I was in grad school in the 90s, and I was reading a lot about, you know, this time period, and you know, it kind of got mentioned, but not a lot. Like it was just sort of a thing that happened, and and so partly I think this is that you remember. This is how you it goes back to my point about this is how you remember and this is how you forget, right? Like we're remembering the 1918 pandemic because now it seems relevant to us.
Yeah, I think, certainly we're hearing about it now, you know, all these comparisons and things like that. Brad, you have a comment or a question for Phil?
Yeah, I'm intrigued by this idea of his relationship with the press and literally hanging out together. I mean, do you think he was able to sort of co-opt and shape his coverage that way? I mean, was he getting more favorable coverage than he otherwise?
Oh yeah. Like he got great coverage. So that's the weird thing about Harding is like you pick up any, you know, generic U.S. history book now, textbook, whatever, you pick up Harding, and he comes across very badly. And I am not saying his presidency went well. You know, if anything, I think Harding should probably disappear as a president, because he's only president for, you know, like a very short period of time. Gets a few things done, has a few scandals, but I mean, but the thing about it is Harding is, from when he's elected, he wins a huge landslide, and he's very popular. And when he dies in office, they build a massive memorial to him, and his press coverage was great. Like I got a quote somewhere in my book about H.G. Wells just singing his praise, and I think it was partly because of what you're talking about. He knew how to communicate. And maybe this is relevant to today, because one of the things that Harding is often criticized for is coming across as inarticulate or illiterate, or maybe not literally illiterate, but sort of like a bumpkin from Ohio, right? But what people miss is like his whole career, he's a newspaper publisher. He wrote editorials, and to sell his newspapers, he literally had to figure out, how do I get people to want to connect to this paper? Like, how do I get them to show up and buy the paper? He's very successful at it. So in one sense, he's very good at communicating in that medium, right? Like so he wasn't going to be like Wilson and write stirring speeches about democracy, but he would tell you a really good story that makes you feel like you're part of the community.
Okay, great. And then Joe, you can wrap up this round. What would you like to ask Phil, or just comment in general about his paper?
Well, I actually have a question, and unfortunately, I'm going to preface it with a long soliloquy, so bear with me. So in 1973, I'm sitting in my dorm room on First Dev East, 141 Dev, and it's the first time I can vote. I'm a freshman at Bonaventure. Now, obviously, I'm not going to go home to Buffalo to vote, so I have an absentee ballot, and I'm filling it in. And so did a lot of other people at Bonaventure. So did thousands of others across the country. Not only college students, but servicemen wherever they are, servicemen and women wherever they are. So we all voted by mail, absentee ballots. And you know what? I look around, the country survived. So was there any sort of correlation in 1920 with people worried about the suppression of the vote? I know Harding won by a landslide, but did that come up at all in any way, shape, or form?
Not in the way we think of, not in the way we had the discussion today. There was discussion about African Americans, Black people voting in the South. And then, so if you look at Harding's speech in Birmingham, Alabama, where he talks about race relations, and there was just recently an op-ed in the Washington Post about this, and he comes out fairly strongly that against segregation. I mean, by modern standards, it doesn't seem much, but in the context of 1920, and it's a pretty progressive stance. But he was also accused of, because at that point, African American Black people voted Republican, so that was the Republican Party in the South. So clearly, there are issues around voter suppression and Jim Crow, but it's not like how we talk about today. Not like people were saying, this form of, it just didn't exist in that I'd see.
Thank you.
Okay, great. I'm going to go to, just going to read one question that we have from Paula, and maybe one for you, Phil, but the other panelists want to chime in. She wants to know if there was similarity in the personalities of the candidates then and now.
I have a hard time with that one because Trump is so not like other presidential candidates and presidents that, I mean, if anything, I could say Trump's ability to communicate over like Twitter and talk in a way that some people can connect with does, I think, resonate with a little bit with Harding. Like Harding got a lot of flack from intellectuals and sort of people for his the way he spoke. I think maybe that is a similarity. I think maybe. Well, I'm thinking off the top of my head. Personality. That's what I'm. Because at the end of the day, I really don't know Biden and Trump. So the only thing I know is their public persona. Yeah.
Well, let me phrase it a different way. Maybe throw it out to the panel. I mean, how big a factor has personality become in the way people vote versus, what they do, what their record is coming in, or what they've accomplished if they're running for re-election?
Well, wasn't there just a poll out that said, I think it was 50% of people said they wouldn't vote for Trump under any circumstances whatsoever? Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. So you got to wonder how much of that is policy and how much of that is personality.
I don't know, Brad, do you have any sense of that? Like what makes people pull the lever one way or the other? So.
Well, obviously it's a combination, but I think Trump's personality is so overwhelming for good or bad. Obviously, I think it's for bad, that it's hard not to have that as a major factor in here. We're seeing that his personal, usually there are two ways, as you know, you measure sort of the efficacy of a candidacy. You have what's called job approval, which is sort of where you think if they're incumbent doing a good job. If it's not that, it's sort of what do they stand for? That's the issue cluster. And then you have favorability, which is more of a straight up popularity contest. Obviously, there's some overlap between the two. But Trump as a person is just so overwhelming in his style and his bearing. And in many ways, his issues are so much a part of it. For example, going back, one of the people that had a very different rating that way was Reagan. Reagan was perceived as a nice, decent human being. Arguably, from my perspective, his policies were the opposite of that. And you would often see that his personal popularity was very high, but his job rating was comparatively low. And in that case, personality trumped everything else because people thought he was a nice, decent guy, even though he thought, ketchup was a vegetable and was late to the AIDS epidemic and so many other things. Here, Trump's performance and Trump's issues are so intertwined you can't separate the two. He behaves in a pretty awful way, and his policies are pretty mean-spirited. So there's such a connection there, unlike, say, Reagan, who on the face of it was a nice person, seemed like a moderate, reasonable, charming guy, yet his policies were very different. To some degree, George W. Bush was that way, where he seemed charming, but the opposite was true. So, I think here it's hard to separate the two.
So I'm still kind of thinking this issue through. Like I think in some ways Trump has taken his public persona, his public personality, and completely merged it with culture wars. And the difference between 1920 and now is, I'm simplifying a little bit here, but in some ways, the culture wars were in front of the Harding campaign, right? They're going to start to emerge in a way that we could see them as culture wars in the 20s, with Scopes monkey trial and a whole bunch of debates over Hollywood and the impact of media on society. But we're kind of constantly in one, and have been in one degree or another in a culture war now for I think most of my adult life. And I think it's hard for me to separate out the personality of some of the candidates, but particularly President Trump, from the culture wars.
Okay, great. Mike had a question, and I think I unmuted him so he can ask it. It was a little longer than Paula's. Mike, if you're there, you want to throw your question out there?
Okay, it kind of relates to the whole culture wars thing, actually, and that is that Trump dominates the airways and front pages, not least because the press is addicted to his outrageousness and buffoonery. As president, as with any president, incumbent president, he can grab the news any day and every day. How does Biden eke out a little coverage and a little more public presence? What does he do?
Seems to me that it's not as important for Joe Biden to kind of eke out coverage in that way. Trump, it's not a situation where the massive media attention for Trump is perceived as a positive by like a lot of voters. His base of support loves it, and a lot of other people hate it. And so, as I said before, I mean, if Biden just sort of stays out of the way, that's almost better for him. So I just don't think, and of course you will see, I think the closer that we get to the election, we'll probably see some more, even-handed coverage in terms of the amount of time. But Biden's style is to be pretty steady, low-key, and Trump's is absolutely not. So I don't think Biden has to worry too much about that, because his support is less that I love Joe Biden, it's that I hate Donald Trump. And I think that sort of message can be conveyed to people who aren't Trump fans by just seeing Trump and not even seeing Biden.
Well, there's a saying in politics that, when somebody's setting themselves on fire, you don't get in the way. And in essence, to go back to your point, that's what Trump is doing. I mean, he is so saturated with what's going on. And I think at this point, more often than not, when he is on either TV or whatever medium, he's actually doing more harm with particularly persuadable voters. Both now his style has worn thin and the substance. I mean, if he obviously thinks he only governs the people who voted for him, and he thinks that somehow that'll also be enough to reelect him, which is highly unlikely. And normally campaigns are trying to, on the one hand, and on the other hand, find a way to reach out to persuadable voters. Trump makes literally no effort to reach out to persuadable voters, such that they exist. First of all, that's a smaller cohort of voters anyway. But if suburban voters, particularly suburban college-educated women, are the electorate that's going to determine things this time, which is conventional wisdom, he is doing everything he possibly can to not only not appeal to that group, but to further alienate them every day. So I think, Joe Biden is probably very happy to sit in his basement. Certainly, I know that the people who are advising him are pretty comfortable with that.
Yeah,
So
I'd have to.
you guys think that this is going to be a policy-free election? How does that compare to 1920?
I think this is a more policy-rich discussion than 1920, because I think now, because of the internet and everything else, I mean, one thing I try to remember, especially when I'm teaching, is like I'm immersed in this stuff all the time. There's a reason I became a history professor. But when I'm teaching someone who's 20, they're not going to go on. They're not going to be following this as closely. But I think there's a lot more. I mean, yeah, the 1920, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party put forward platforms and statements, but not at the level that I think tends to happen today. So I mean, like, I think politics has always had a certain amount of showmanship. There's, a certain amount of whatever you want to call it to it. Like, I don't think this is 1800 was not had some mudslung in it in that election too.
I think for me, what will be interesting is the conventions. So if Biden is still in his cellar, so to speak, and if the Democratic convention now, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Democratic convention is going to be virtually online. So Biden will get, candidates usually get a bump after the convention. So if Biden can come through with whatever the Democratic Party platform is, and his vice presidential pick will be getting a lot of news as well, that'll be great for him. He won't have to campaign perhaps the traditional way. Trump now, we know it's going to be Trump-Pence, but it's going to be outside in August in Jacksonville, or maybe part of it's going to be inside. Who knows what's going to come out of all that? So I think as far as getting press goes, I'd like to see the press coverage of the conventions, especially the Republican convention, and especially if it's a million degrees and a bazillion degrees in humidity in the dew point, and if it rains. I just think that's a disaster waiting to happen.
Yeah. Joe, when we were starting this discussion, I just wanted to get your thoughts on what do you see the role of the press if Biden's not campaigning or not, kind of taking the strategy which we see, letting Trump be out there and maybe do more harm than good to himself. You think the press has a responsibility to maybe more proactively cover Biden?
I think the press has a responsibility to listen to whatever he says, whenever he says it, and really hold his feet to the fire, so to speak, making sure he's speaking truth to power. We all know that Biden has this reputation of putting his foot in his mouth sometimes. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. So it'd be interesting to see what kind of gaffes he makes, if he makes any, and how well that is covered and how well that is responded to by the other party functionaries. So I think the perception might be that some in the press are going to give Biden a free ride, and I think that there's going to be a lot of overcompensation to make sure that doesn't happen.
Brad, were you going to chime in on something there?
I was going to follow up. That's a big difference between then and now. In 1920, the political parties were really strong. Like, they picked Harding, they managed Harding's campaign. Harding's a party man, right? And the political parties don't have near the influence they used to have over these things.
Well, if you're asking what is the role of the press or what should they be doing, obviously they need to hold Vice President Biden accountable, but maybe they'll get around to that after they hold Trump accountable. I'm a bit of a cynic as to the role of the press for this, because I think they're less about truth and more about just sort of getting, now clickbait more than ever. So whether it's ratings, whatever, I'm skeptical about the press holding anybody's feet to the fire.
Okay. Joe, you mentioned the conventions and vice presidential choice. Paula had a question about vice presidents, and can you just remind everyone, if you're not talking, to mute your microphone, get a little static. But Paula, you want to ask your question about the vice president's roles?
So, I was just curious, how influential the vice president candidates were back then, and knowing that we don't know exactly who Biden's going to pick, but it may sway the vote because with everything that's going on, with social reform, it's anticipated to be a Black female. And right now, Pence, it looks like Trump may dump him, and he's basically put Pence in charge of this whole pandemic, and he's gonna use that as a excuse if he does dump Pence. That's what I heard. So back then, how influential would a vice president candidate have in terms of swaying votes versus the actual candidate
Well,
compared to now?
the short answer would be they're often picked to try and balance out things within the party, because the parties had much, it's not like they've gone completely away, but, well, mostly they've gone away. But back then the party had wings. You know, there was like Southern conservative Democrats, Northern liberal Democrats. Or there'd be Eastern and Western, particularly in the Republican Party. So they often pick whoever won the presidency, you would pick the vice president to sort of appease the other faction in the party. And so, for example, when Harding's nominated, he's actually, the saying is he's everybody's second choice. That they were planning on nominating Teddy Roosevelt. Roosevelt dies in 19. So they have these sort of, the weird sort of hybrid thing in the sense that they have some primaries, but the primary system is not as well established that you can't just win the nomination through the primary system. You still have to go to the convention. So basically, short story is like everybody else deadlocks. They meet in a room and they're like, okay, Harding's good. He's there, you know, like nobody dislikes Harding. He works. We can make him president. And then Coolidge was actually picked by the convention, off the convention floor by acclamation. So, you know, that's kind of how Coolidge got on the ticket. But I don't think, I don't know, maybe something else is better, that a vice president actually like tipped the scales and put somebody over the top and be president. So I think Biden's kind of pursuing a strategy. If he's on top of, if he's leading a political party that's very multicultural, he needs to represent, have that represented on the ticket, that other faction, if you will.
Just folks on the panel, I mean, how important do you think Biden's choice is going to be?
I would say that if it's that somebody in his position, which is around 9 or 10 points ahead right now, you first want to do no harm. That suggests kind of a safe pick. It's unlike, say, in 2008 with John McCain picking Sarah Palin. He was behind, had to shake up the race by choosing somebody who was really sort of unusual or different. I tend to think that Trump and the people who love and the people who hate Trump, that's going to be the primary factor in determining the election, not who the vice president is.
I think that's fundamentally right. I mean, vice presidents rarely influence elections, despite what people say. But I think there is a burden on him to maybe make history. And of course, the other factor is, given his age, people may look at it as needing to have someone who is capable of stepping into the presidency. So I also think he is likely to be somewhat constrained in his choice. And as a former vice president, he certainly appreciates that that's the main role of the vice president.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with everything that everyone said so far. I just wonder if it's going to be, you know, a lot of people are talking about current sitting senators. And if the Democrats are making a push to flip the Senate, I wonder if it will be some of those current senators, like a Tammy Duckworth or a Kamala Harris. So I don't know.
Well, the Democrats don't have much to worry on that front, because the appointment powers in the states that do the appointments are all Democratic governors in those states. The only one which is potentially risky, in Massachusetts, Elizabeth Warren the GOP governor there could appoint a Republican. But the catch there is that the Democrats have such a huge majority in the legislature that they could quickly pass a law saying it's got to be from the same party.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting. We talked about the role of the vice presidents. I had class I taught in the spring. One of my guest speakers he had worked on the 2008 Obama campaign. The student asked him about turning points, and in that race, he said it was the two vice presidential selections. He said once McCain, chose Sarah Palin, he got a bump, and it ended up not working out. And he also reminded me that there was a certain amount of excitement in the way Biden was chosen. You could send your cell number and they would text you, and all of a sudden you were part of this group that was supposed to find out first. But I think it got leaked to the New York Times ahead of all the notifications anyway. So we're coming up on the end of the hour. It's been I think a great discussion. It's thundering and lightning outside my house, but the internet is still working, so that's a good sign. Let me just go through the panel, see if you have any final words, and we'll let Phil kind of finish it up, and I'll go in reverse order because I've been starting with Lou. So, Joe, any final closing thoughts?
I was hoping to be last, so I could gather my thoughts. No, I enjoyed this. I didn't think about the Democratic governors appointing senators. So it's been a fascinating discussion, and I especially enjoyed the paper. Thank you.
Yes,
Okay,
great.
thanks. Yeah, no, I agree. It's been a great discussion, and hope the folks watching now enjoy it, and we'll have the whole recording online. I forgot to give a pitch for the website. It's jandoli.net. You can read Phil's paper there and some of the other ones as well. Okay, Brad.
Just want to say thank you for inviting me, and I learned something tonight. But I think to some degree, this campaign is, despite some of the circumstances, not entirely analogous to anything else, because anything with Trump is not analogous to anything else.
Yeah, I think even without the pandemic, it would have been a unique campaign. Yeah. Okay. And Lou, I guess you started things. You can close them.
Yeah. Well, I was just curious. I recall reading in my high school textbook that there is some thinking about Harding's victory, that it may have owed something to being the first election in which women voted, and that he was thought to be handsome. Is that thought to be true today?
No. All right, so there's two answers to that. There's one, because this is the first national election women can vote in, and women basically voted the same way men did. Like, there's not a significant gender gap. But one thing you can see, if you look at what the Republicans are doing, and Harding is in this group, they don't know how women are going to vote. So if you go, so we're looking backwards, but if you're in like the summer before November, they're like, how are women going to vote? So when they pick Harding, they think he looks like a movie star. Like that is something they're saying. They think he looks like a Roman senator. And that's one of the reasons they put him on movie cameras all the time. Like this is the first campaign to deploy celebrities. Like movie stars are brought in to Marion and Porch with Harding. So they think that's going to work. But they also have the Harding campaign has a social justice day where women march through the street. You have this whole ceremony they do. And Harding comes out and gives a speech, and he talks about Florence and how much his wife, and how much she's a working woman in the newspaper. And he makes promises like equal pay for equal work, essentially to support daycare centers, because he's trying to attract women voters.
Okay, well, those are good words to end by. But if you want to, just say anything else to wrap up, Phil.
No, this has been a lot of fun. This gives me some chance to sort of think through some things. And I guess if anything, and I don't want to open a can of worms with like 3 minutes ago or something, I keep thinking about how, in 20, often what I'll tell my students is, if you're looking historically, especially once you start getting into the modern presidency, the campaign that sort of best masters the media, the new media that's sort of on the cusp of maturing, the emerging media, tends to win. So FDR and radio, Harding and movies, commercials and Eisenhower, right? And Kennedy and televised debates. And I'm wondering if maybe we're not putting the wrong lens on Biden, because we're thinking like, well, he's not he's not dominating cable news, although maybe just tells the tale of the times. We dropped cable like years ago. We're all on the internet. But how much is that if you're just looking at whatever CNN and Fox News is doing, you're missing it because the real action is taking place on like Twitter and Facebook and those places. And it doesn't, maybe we're asking the wrong questions about what Biden or Trump are doing. Maybe that's the lesson of like Cambridge Analytica.
Okay. Well, thanks. I've enjoyed it too. It's been a great discussion. I've enjoyed all of these as a chance to really like dig into some events, have an hour or so of really thoughtful, engaging conversation, and this was. So I want to thank Phil Payne for writing the paper that we discussed. Thank the panel, Lou Jacobson, Brad Lawrence, Joe Marin. We doing this again next week, kind of doing a much different topic. It's on the role of sports for enjoyment versus sports as a business. Paul Whelan, who's one of our adjunct professors, worked with Buffalo Sabres for a number of years, wrote that one, and I'm putting together another great panel. So thanks again, Phil. Thanks, panelists. Thanks, folks who joined us either live or on the recording. So I'm going to sign off. Wish everybody a great night.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.